Close encounters of the fourth kind, more commonly known as alien abductions, is a phenomenon that has been discussed for more than 50 years. Among the many stories, that of Barney and Betty Hill caused a sensation in the public domain and raised many questions to be resolved among the communities of ufologists and scholars of the paranormal. It is the night of September the 19th, 1961, and Barney and Betty Hill, the young couple from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, are driving along the highway that passes between the White Mountains, when suddenly their car is enveloped inside a dazzling beam of light. A few moments pass, and the moment that light goes out, it causes a blackout in their minds. From that moment, all their memories will soon vanish into thin air. It is 10 p.m. when their car starts again. Barney is agitated and wants to get away from that narrow and isolated mountain road as soon as possible. When they finally return home, at dawn, the couple is shocked. The two immediately realize that the time elapsed is really too much for a journey that would normally last 2 hours. In the following days, they suffer acute migraines, and after about 10 days, Betty is the victim of frightening nightmares. Several times she dreams of being inside an operating room, where doctors with grotesque somatic features different from human ones want to operate on her. But time passes, and the memory becomes more and more faded and confused. The couple then decides to undergo a regressive hypnosis session, during which their memories, little by little, begin to resurface. A light from the sky, a flying saucer, strange grey-skinned beings, and invasive medical tests with scientific equipment. These are the details that make up part of Barney and Betty's account of that night. Barney and Betty Hill's testimony thus becomes the first of an alien abduction in human history, but it will certainly not be the last, since afterwards many other people would suffer the same fate as the Portsmouth couple. Of all of the many events concerning abductees, or people kidnapped by extraterrestrial entities, one of the most particular and important in modern ufology is undoubtedly that of the New York housewife Linda Napolitano, who in the early 90s had worldwide resonance, reopening the debate on the phenomenon of alien abductions. The story we are about to tell you is based on various statements and reports that Linda Napolitano and the ufologist Bud Hopkins have released over the years. This is not just the story of a woman and her experience on the edge of reality. This is the story of the alien abduction of the century. In April 1989, ufologist Bud Hopkins receives a letter from a woman named Linda Napolitano, an ordinary housewife who lives on the Lower East Side of New York City. Linda writes that in 1976 she noticed a strange bump near her nose, and after careful analysis by the doctors, they were sure that the woman had undergone surgery as a child. But Linda had never undergone such an operation, nor did she remember it. Hopkins decides to follow the case with the hope of finding tangible medical evidence of alien implants inside a human body. He then organizes a meeting to discuss the woman's past experiences. They meet for the first time in Bud's office, where for an hour she talks to him about her past, a common life, similar to that of many others, were it not for this strange problem related to the operation on her nose. Linda's accounts do not immediately appear to be related to any alien abductions. She then starts attending abduction case support group meetings held by Professor Hopkins himself. The woman listens to the accounts of deeply troubled people who speak of dazzling lights in the sky, strange humanoid beings, and mysterious objects being implanted in their bodies. Linda is just a passive listener, at least until something out of this world occurs, something that leads her to doubt her entire existence. On the night of November the 30th, 1989, her life changed forever, unexpectedly becoming the protagonist of what experts will later call the alien abduction of the century. It is a cold, late autumn evening when, after tucking her children into bed, Linda lies down on her bed with her husband to rest after a hectic day in the streets of the Big Apple. It is just past 3 in the morning. Without warning, Linda is woken up by the feeling that someone is at the foot of her bed, watching her. Her eyes, still half asleep, scan the corners of the room until they see a figure standing in front of her in the darkness. It is a small, skeletal-bodied creature with a large head and whose eyes are completely black, and it is watching her. The being, just over 1.20 meters tall, remains motionless, staring at the woman, who, finally realizing that she is not dreaming, becomes scared and tries to wake her husband, who is next to her in a state of deep sleep. But then, out of nowhere, something similar to a thought resounds in her head, and a voice whispers, "Shut up." The message, probably telepathic, throws Linda into a complete state of pure terror. The woman tries to scream, but immediately realizes that she is unable to. Her mouth and eyes are blocked by something similar to a white sheet. Linda falls back onto the bed. She begins to struggle with all her strength to remove that sheet, until a sense of numbness begins to run through her body, from the tips of her toes to the top of her head. Now that the woman is totally paralyzed, the white cloth on her face seems to dematerialize, allowing her to see the bedroom window. From outside, a very strong blue light floods into and illuminates the room. Linda feels her body rise from the bed and close into a fetal position, to then float towards the origin of that beam of light. Her body passes through the window panes and the metal bars fixed outside it, and she finds herself floating outside, 50 meters above the ground. This invisible force makes her float above the city. She describes the event in detail. She can see the car's headlights, the smoke from the chimneys, and the Brooklyn Bridge. But she is not alone on her voyage. Next to her, there is the being she saw in the bedroom, followed by 2 other small grey creatures. Fully aware of what is happening to her, Linda continues to soar into the sky until she catches sight of a huge spaceship suspended above her. The windowless aircraft is oyster-shaped, with dozens of coloured lights along its fuselage. A hatch opens, and the blue light transports Linda and the 3 grey beings inside the spacecraft. Then the hatch closes, and the spaceship blasts off into space. Once inside the spaceship, the woman finds herself in front of a bizarre vision. In the first room, its walls an aseptic white colour, there are some benches, similar to those she had seen in Central Park during Sunday walks with her family. However, she doesn't have time to ponder that bizarre detail as the driving force of the light carries her down a long corridor. After passing through several sliding doors, she reaches a large room where the 3 grey beings are waiting for her. In the centre of the room, she sees a long table which she is laid out upon. Linda tries to move, to react to all of this, but once again, to no avail. Until she realizes she can move her mouth, her jaws, and her cheeks. She understands that the only thing she can do is to scream out loud. But her screams, for some strange reason, turn into an echo which rebounds on the large dome of the strange operating room. Her screams are so loud that one of the grey beings reacts in a strange way. It puts a hand over Linda's mouth and tries to shut her up, but she gives no signs of letting up and continues to scream louder and louder. Until one of the three beings sticks a long, thin barrel of a gun-like object into her nose, firing a small object into her left nostril. At that exact moment, Linda blacks out, which lasts no more than a few seconds, and when she opens her eyes, she finds herself lying in her own bed, next to her husband, as if nothing had happened. The bedside alarm clock tells her it is 5 in the morning. As soon as she gets her breath back, Linda wipes the sweat from her forehead and, not giving too much importance to what happened, labels the event as just a terrible nightmare. The following morning, as happens with a dream, the memories of that kidnapping become increasingly blurred, and Linda slowly begins to forget how she was transported into that spaceship, what she saw inside, and what they did to her. The only things she remembers are the three grey aliens, being aboard something not belonging to our world, and that anxious feeling of being completely, physically paralysed. Linda then convinces herself to call Bud Hopkins, the only person who can help her in this situation. Over the phone, Linda tells Bud in detail the whole experience of the previous night, and he realizes he is faced with an incomplete story. So the two set up an appointment in Bud's office a few days later. On the day of the meeting, Linda is subjected to a session of regressive hypnosis, a set of techniques that bring about a state of being in a hypnotic trance, aimed at recalling past traumas. Through the use of his voice, the hypnotist guides the subject into a state of trance, and in the moment of maximum concentration, leads the subject to evoke specific moments, or the first moment memorized, through a succession of memories. During the session, Bud and Linda achieve great results. She can remember floating outside the window of her apartment, 12 floors above the ground. And she also remembers rising in a bluish-white beam of light into a spaceship hovering above the building. Throughout his life, Bud Hopkins followed more than 300 patients with abduction experiences, and in the American UFO community, he was considered one of the leading experts on the subject. Born on June 15, 1931, in Wheeling, West Virginia, he graduated in 1953 in art from Oberlin College and then moved to New York, where he consecrated his career as a contemporary painter. His works of art can be found in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art. At the age of 7, Hopkins experienced firsthand the aftermath of Orson Welles' 1938 radio show War of the Worlds, which terrified both him and his family and left very deep psychological scars. Considering the radio broadcast as a bad taste hoax, he became very skeptical of the idea of extraterrestrial life, rather than approaching it. He will discover his interest in ufology when, in August 1964, he and two of his friends report having experienced the daytime sighting of a UFO off Cape Cod in Truro, Massachusetts, and which he later described to the authorities as a saucer-shaped metal object that soared fast through the sky. Dissatisfied, however, with the response he received once he reported the incident to the nearby Otis Air National Guard base, he began to suspect a possible government cover-up. In the following years, Hopkins began studying the UFO phenomenon and collected the stories of people who claimed to have had contact with alien beings. In 1975, Hopkins was approached by George Obarski, who allegedly saw alien figures come out of a spaceship and take soil samples in the North Hudson Park, North Bergen, New Jersey. Hopkins investigates the incident together with Ted Blurcher, then director of the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, and Jerry Sturger, agent of MUFON. After Hopkins' account of the Obarski case appeared in The Village Voice in 1976, he began to regularly receive letters from other UFO witnesses, including some missing time cases, namely seemingly unexplained gaps in abductees' memories. The great majority of these cases did not even remember being kidnapped, but only had images, such as the faces of strange beings, that occasionally came up in their memories. Behavioral patterns extrapolated from abductees' letters led Hopkins to identify common, fundamental emotional responses based on their experiences. Fear, awe or wonder at alien technological capabilities, affection for their captors, anger, and helplessness. Often, as happened in the case of Linda Napolitano, he reiterated his theory that these life forms from another planet are insensitive to human emotions, failing to understand the trauma that a kidnapping can cause to the victim. He labels these phenomena as not dangerous from a physical point of view, but capable of leaving deep scars in the psyche of their patients, which get worse following the reaction of a general public when hearing such stories. Linda is undoubtedly one of the most interesting patients he ever had to deal with, and after several sessions, the two managed to reconstruct in detail all the events of that November the 30th, at least up until the moment when Linda was laid out on the table by the three grey beings. However, the Napolitano case soon takes an unexpected direction when, in February 1991, Hopkins receives a letter signed by two men. Their surnames are not specified, they only sign with their first names, namely Richard and Dan. The two men claim that they are mere police officers who said they were in a car under the elevated FDR Drive that night at around 3 a.m. in the morning. Both of the men claimed to have seen a reddish-orange object hovering in the sky, bright and with green lights along its fuselage. Incredulous in front of that vision, they remained to observe it, trying to give it rational explanation. In addition, Richard and Dan saw a woman floating in the sky above Manhattan, along with three grey figures, all the height of a child. Later, the four would enter the flying object, which soon disappeared from their view. The two police officers reveal that they are extremely worried about Linda's condition, and that is the reason why they are looking for her. Finally, they reassure Bud that they aren't dangerous. They just want to talk to the woman and make sure that she's okay. Hopkins immediately contacts Linda, telling her that very likely she will soon receive a visit from the two witnesses at her home. A few days later, the phone in Hopkins' office rings. On the other end of the phone, Linda confirms Bud's prediction. It's all true. Richard and Dan came to visit her. When they knock on her door, Introducing themselves as police officers, she is incredulous. She never imagined that Hopkins' prediction about the visit would actually come true. After all, policemen often knocked on her door, but usually to ask for information or witness testimony on the petty crimes that usually happened in her area, theft or drug dealing, things that Linda had never been interested in her life. The woman was above all amazed at the nature of the subject for which they came to visit her, an alien abduction. But the story certainly didn't end there. Richard and Dan were moved as soon as they saw Linda alive and well. Dan, in particular, knelt down in front of her and started crying with joy even before entering the house. Linda defines that meeting as rather pleasant, where between coffee and pastries, the three tell each other about their experiences of that night, almost as if they were old friends. After about an hour, the two agents leave the house, wishing Linda all the best in life. But a few weeks later, Bud receives a second letter written by Richard. Apparently, after the meeting with Linda, the life of the two agents had changed radically. In those pages, Richard declares he is worried about the mental state of his colleague. In fact, Dan had taken time off work due to the high level of stress. Meeting Linda had caused Dan a mental trauma, changing his character and making him morbidly attracted to the woman. Richard even goes so far as to confess that Dan is spying on Linda and following her every move by lurking in front of her apartment every day. This statement is also confirmed by Linda, as, according to her, a white van would often be parked in front of her house. But Richard's confessions do not end there. Bud receives a third letter in which Richard declares that he and Dan are not actually policemen, but security agents who were escorting an important political figure on the night of November the 30th, 1989. As Richard states, this important political figure was a leading figure in the geopolitical balance of the world, and even more importantly, had witnessed Linda's abduction, demonstrating concern for the safety of humanity in the face of a threat from an extraterrestrial civilization. Hopkins is now certain that this case is not like all the others, and soon other people come forward to tell him what they saw that night. Bright lights in the sky, flying beings suspended in the air, and a strange flying machine. In all, there are 24 eyewitnesses to the event, making this the largest sighting in the history of the state of New York and probably the entire United States of America. But the matter does not end there. It is April 1991, and Linda Napolitano is walking down the street near her apartment when a car, with Richard and Dan inside, pulls up beside her. The two men greet her and politely ask her to get into the car without asking questions, but she refuses. At this point, the situation becomes tense. Richard forces Linda to get into the back seat. The two agents interrogate Linda for more than 3 hours, repeatedly asking her about the aliens. what they did to her, and what they told her. They even force her to take off her shoes in order to examine whether her feet are human or alien. Richard and Dan no longer seem like the two kind police officers who showed up at her door weeks earlier. Once released, Linda rushes to Hopkins' office, telling him in detail about what had happened to her. But a couple of weeks later, another meeting between the woman and the two alleged agents occurs. Regarding this encounter, we must consider a detailed reconstruction of the event that Linda recounts in 1992 to journalists Joseph J. Stefula, Richard D. Butler, and George P. Hansen. All three professionals in their sector called to investigate the veracity of Linda and Hopkins' statements about the event. This is the detailed account of the second kidnapping present in the article A Critique of Bud Hopkins' Case of the Linda Napolitano Alien Abduction. On the morning of October 15th, 1991, Dan approaches Linda in a red Jaguar. Richard forces her to get into the car, where yet another interrogation begins. Linda has a tape recorder with her. She tries to record the conversation, but Richard notices the device and promptly confiscates it. Dan drives the Jaguar to Long Island, reaching a beach house. Once inside the beach house, Dan asks Linda to wear a white nightgown like the one she wore during the kidnapping. But Linda refuses to get undressed in front of the two men. According to Linda, Dan wanted to have sex with her, but she rejects him, and at that point the man kneels in front of her, repeatedly calling her the Lady of the Sand. Later, taking advantage of a moment when the two men are distracted, Linda escapes from the house and starts running along the beach in search of help. But Dan runs out of the house and starts chasing her until he finally catches her. He blocks her arms and immobilizes her on the wet sand, and then drags her into the ocean, where he holds her head underwater for several seconds. Then suddenly an invisible force strikes him, knocking him to the ground a few meters from the woman. Freed from his clutches, Linda continues to run away, but Richard manages to stop her, even convincing her to return to the house, with a promise to keep Dan and his delusions at bay. Back in the house, while Richard tries to calm Dan down by putting him under a cold shower, Linda gets a chance to search through the documents held by the two agents. Thus, she finds a letter on Central Intelligence Agency headed paper. Finally, after further questioning, she is taken back to the same street where they kidnapped her a few hours earlier. Strongly traumatized by the incident, Linda meets Richard only one more time. The meeting takes place, by chance, while he is leaving a bank in November 1991. Richard tells her that he no longer works with Dan because Dan's mental conditions have deteriorated to the point that he has been locked up in a facility for the mentally ill. But at Christmas, the woman receives a letter from Dan. 3 pages in which the former agent confesses that he has fallen madly in love with her, and that in the past he had thought of kidnapping her to live with her until the end of time. This, however, is the last time Linda will hear anything about Dan. Hopkins, in the meantime, analyzes all of these events for the purpose of his research. His curiosity focuses on the license plate number of the Jaguar that kidnapped Linda. Thus, after meticulous research, he comes to the conclusion that it is a means of transport supplied to particular government agencies. However, their names or specific functions will never be specified. Linda seriously begins to worry about her safety and that of her family, and paranoia is becoming more and more present in her life. She sees men in black suits following her wherever she goes, and informs Hopkins that black cars with government agents inside them are parked outside her house, day and night. But it is now that he, the man pulling the strings from the shadows, comes into play. Hopkins receives a signed letter from the third man. This powerful man, who witnessed the kidnapping that night, finally steps forward. In the letter, there is not a detailed account of what happened that night, but rather a series of information and warnings that will leave every reader speechless. The third man talks about the ecological danger that the planet is heading towards, that superior forces are enormously worried about. Moreover, it seems there is also talk of alien involvement in ending the Cold War. The letter ends with an ominous warning to Bud Hopkins. The third man begs him to stop investigating, otherwise he could undermine the foundations of life itself on this planet. Hopkins, receiving this letter, is certain that some of the cars parked near Linda's apartment have number plates belonging to various diplomatic corps stationed at the United Nations. This is the reason why he is convinced that the third man is actually Javier Pérez de Cuellar, the UN Secretary General. So, what do Linda, Dan, Richard, and the third man have in common? Thanks to subsequent regressive hypnosis sessions, Linda remembers being on a beach with Dan, Richard, and the third man in the past, therefore coming to believe she was used by aliens as a tool to get the attention of the third man. After all, the other three witnesses in the letters also claim to have felt a strange vibration possessing them in the moments before the sighting that November night. Perhaps, as Hopkins also hypothesizes, the four had already been kidnapped together years ago, probably when they were all still children. Perhaps the four of them had seen their own adult bodies projected onto that beach, in a sort of free zone, disconnected from space-time that all humans experience. This could also explain Dan's morbid emotional and sexual attraction towards Linda, seen by Dan as a mysterious female figure linked to him from an early age. A clue to this first kidnapping can be found in the words of the doctor who, in 1976, after an analysis, had come to the conclusion that Linda had undergone no surgery when she was still a child. An operation that, as her mother also recalled, had never taken place. To test this hypothesis, a doctor, a friend of Linda's, offers to perform an X-ray of her head. A few days later, the doctor shows up at Linda's door with the results of the X-ray. He is surprised and visibly nervous, greets the woman, then leaves without explaining what he actually discovered in the X-ray. Linda takes the results to Hopkins, who in turn shows them to a neurosurgeon friend of his. The neurosurgeon is stunned. In Linda's nasal area, an object of considerable size can be seen, clearly not natural, but artificially implanted. The object is about 6 millimeters long and has a curly wire structure on each end. This discovery is colossal. However, before further analysis can be made, the object disappears from Linda's nose, leaving Hopkins empty-handed. To date, no one knows whether that implant was removed by aliens following yet another kidnapping, or if it dissolved by itself after being discovered. Later, even the government agents stop following Linda, and over time, her life finally returns to normal. This is the final chapter of the story of Linda Napolitano, an ordinary woman who found herself at the center of a story worthy of a science fiction film. In the years following these events, Bud Hopkins continued to gather information and in 1992 wrote a book entitled Witnessed. Although in the years that followed, many skeptics have claimed that Linda Napolitano's story is a well-orchestrated hoax, this case, with its 24 witnesses, remains one of the most interesting and mysterious in modern-day ufology. But one question remains. Why would highly advanced terrestrial civilizations kidnap innocent people for their scientific interests? The answer could be found in the studies of a certain Professor Corrado Malanga. In Italy, Professor Corrado Malanga has been studying the phenomenon of alien abduction for years and believes he has found the solution to this intricate and mysterious question. His insights, however, go far beyond everything that history books have always taught us. University professor and researcher at the Department of Chemistry and Industrial Chemistry at Pisa University, where he teaches organic chemistry, for over 40 years he has been interested in issues related to UFO research. Research organizer for the CUN, the National UFO Center, he has carried out vast specific research on abductees. During his work, Malanga also uses regressive hypnosis as a direct research tool in the abductee's mind, but makes the method more effective and targeted thanks to the use of neuro-linguistic programming. Together with his collaborators, he has performed over 3,500 hypnosis sessions on his patients. And with his studio, he provides modern interpretations of the entire phenomenology, as well as a new approach to solving the problems connected to it. According to Malanga, through the hypnosis sessions he performed, his intent was to put the conscious side of the mind to sleep for a short period of time, in order to make the unconscious side, that which is connected directly to the soul, emerge, where, in the worst cases, it was also possible to find an unwanted alien parasite, or its alien mind, which is copied into that of the person kidnapped. These hypnosis sessions that Malanga performed in order to make the abductee's experiences re-emerge at a conscious level therefore seems to have raised the possibility that some of these minds were manipulated by the aliens themselves in order to hide their work. The final goal of Malanga's study, therefore, was to lead us into the depth of the abductee's memory. The place where, according to Professor Malanga, 3 different levels of consciousness develop: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious, connected to the id, the ego, and the superego. Using his regressive hypnosis technique, Malanga tries to reach the unconscious in the memories of abductees, who have literally removed the traumatic event by replacing it, or without their knowledge, covered it with other images. According to Malanga's theory, the unconscious would be, in fact, like a write-only hard disk. A place in which nothing can be erased. A sort of papyrus upon which the observed truth is uniquely imprinted. A truth that therefore would find a way not to be affected nor compromised by other memory substrates which have been influenced by external factors. Therefore, the unconscious would always record everything, storing all of the information, which would only re-emerge under hypnosis or in certain particular situations, such as relaxation, meditation, or spiritual techniques. While examining the various witness accounts he had obtained, the professor was able to note how all the abductees examined could not clearly remember the experiences of meeting with extraterrestrial beings. They only remember them with the passage of time. In fact, deep within these people, a trauma is lurking, which is ready to appear from one day to the next. These stories that shock Malanga's mind and, at first glance, seem like science fiction, induce the professor to investigate further. In fact, although the stories are told by different subjects, they are all repeated in similar ways and with details that coincide. In Italy, at the end of the 1990s, Malanga received from the CUN, the National UFO Center, the task of documenting and investigating the case of Valerio Lonzi, a young man from Genoa who at the time told newspapers about his abduction. Valerio claimed that at the age of 15 he was subjected to strange attention from beings from another planet. Reading this newspaper report, Malanga and the managers of the CUN thought that this story told by Valerio was just a simple marketing strategy built in order to sponsor the opening of a new restaurant that he owned. But once they meet, Malanga soon realizes that Valerio's stories are all true. In almost 3 years of study, the professor subjects the young Valerio to all the necessary studies, also using the regressive hypnosis technique. Malanga's final report tells of scars, implanted microchips, bruises, and a complete set of memories and details that are directly connected to different testimonies reported in the American cases. Meanwhile, in addition to research into the deeper layers of memory, the professor studies the microchips found in the different subjects examined. To do so, he uses a non-direct technique, where the foreign bodies found are not extracted from the patient, as in the American research. Instead, they are subjected to suitable nuclear magnetic resonance analysis and structure mass spectrometry. The results of Malanga's studies are quite outstanding. It emerges that the isotopic percentage of these objects studied is different from that of any other material present on our planet. This means that the neutron component that makes up these microchips is different. A piece of data that, in no way, can be modified. We can therefore reach only one possible conclusion, which is also confirmed by the positive feedback from the studies conducted by the Americans. It is stated that the origin of the objects has different physical characteristics than those on Earth. Therefore, their provenance can only be of alien origin. At this point, a question spontaneously arises in Professor Malanga's mind. Why do these alien beings come to visit us so often? When Malanga began conducting his studies, he was just intrigued by the phenomenon and thought that aliens were ancient beings, that is, beings who are older and more aware than man. But he never would have imagined that instead, the more spiritually evolved species was, in fact, the human race. From a first analysis, the subjects under hypnosis state that they were placed on an operating table and subsequently operated on surgically, where microchips were inserted inside their bodies. But not only that, in fact, in addition, the operation changes according to the sex of the subject. In females, the genital apparatus is often used to introduce a kind of ovum, which is left to mature for about 3 months and subsequently removed through a second kidnapping. This egg, now in the form of a blastula, is then placed in a small container, which has the appearance of a sort of glass bottle. The container is then transported to a room full of similar bottles of various sizes. All of these bottles are filled with a transparent liquid, where both human and alien beings float inside them, all of them with completely different features. These bottles, which are in essence artificial placentas, as Malanga explains, change their shape as the subject grows inside them, until they become large glass cylinders that can reach heights of up to 2.5 meters. The idea that evolved from these initial findings is that aliens are sterile and therefore must use humans to reproduce. Such as sperm sampling in males and egg tests in females, both hypotheses true according to Malanga, but only a small part of the truth. Behind these kidnappings lies another, more shocking mission, which Malanga realizes by pure chance during a session. Malanga believes that humans, to the aliens, are simply cows to be milked, and that the Earth is nothing more to them than their farm. But if for the aliens, man turns out to be a cow, then what is the milk they would like to obtain from us? These beings are simply looking for life, because they, as beings, absolutely do not want to die. Malanga discovers that within our bodies there is an area of awareness in which immortality is hidden. The subjects undergoing deep hypnosis, he explains, all report the same details. It begins with a view from above where the abductees observe their body lying on a metal bed, the same bed described by everybody, which has a single slightly cone-shaped leg that supports it. But as hypnosis continues, the subject no longer just sees their own body, they observe two of them. One lying on the metal bed, and another inside a large cylinder. A being with the same features, a kind of carbon copy of themselves. At this point, the hypnosis technique involves asking control questions with the intent of establishing whether the subject actually remembers what he or she is telling, or revisiting, as the hypnosis manual says, or whether he or she is inventing the events. The questions that Malanga asks at this point are the following. Look at your hands, and the subject in hypnosis replies, but I don't have hands. Look at your body, and the subject replies, but I don't see a body. Then the question, what is your name, receives an ambiguous answer. The subject replies, but we have no name. We. An answer in the plural that leaves Malanga and his collaborators amazed. Incredulous of what they heard, and after 30 seconds of long silence, this voice starts talking again. I know his name. What I see below is my container. I live in it. I came there to have the experience. At this point, Malanga asks for confirmation of its identity. So define yourself. Who are you? The reply is, I am life, a matrix of points of light. Then Malanga asks, do you know what those strange beings who come to get you want from you? And the voice replies, they don't want my container. They want me, because I am life, and they don't want to die. After 300 cases analysed, where questions and answers were always the same, this entity was perceived as something that answered and had its own consciousness, and it lives inside our body. Therefore, Malanga and his collaborators gave it a conventional name, the soul. After understanding this truth, it was important for Professor Malanga to understand what man was like from deep within. In the human container, as Malanga describes to us, there are two other pieces, a mental part and a spiritual part. The mental part is made up of space and time. The spiritual part is made up of energy and time, but not of space. Each of these parts lacks a vector. The spirit lacks space, the soul lacks time, and the mental part lacks energy. The alien is interested in the part that is the soul, that is, the timeless part. Malanga explains that the alien tries to overcome this desire not to die, using a piece of our soul part, because since it does not have the temporal element, it is immortal. The alien possesses a mind, a body, a spirit, but it lacks this detail, and therefore is unaware that death does not exist. Installing within itself the idea that it must take life from someone else, because in this way it avoids death. These three components are characterized by a frequency and self-awareness. In essence, it is as if we are three things. The professor, in fact, quotes the sacred texts of the Church. We are the tabernacle of the Most Holy Trinity. With the hypnosis technique taught by Malanga, we discover the truth about this Most Holy Trinity. That is, a soul part, or the feminine part of us, a spiritual part, that is, the male part of us, and finally the mental part, the androgynous part of us. But what technology do the aliens use to take this part of our soul from us? Malanga describes that once the subject is placed on the metal table, but also inside these strange cylinders, a technique is used that resembles the equalization of sound. That is, the alien makes the subject's body vibrate with a certain frequency. Once the correct frequency is reached, the soul part detaches from its container, which is our physical body, and is placed in a tube. Later, through this tube, it ends up inside an alien body. At this point, during regressive hypnosis, an amazing event occurs. The patient's memories become those of the alien. In that instant, our soul part gives life to the alien who is about to die. And once life is given to it, the soul part is taken up and repositioned in the original container. The only place where it can be found and retrieved again. The human being, in some way, explains Malanga, through its genetic material, makes sure that the physical life of the alien continues. This discovery leads the professor to another extraordinary revelation. He discovers that human beings are immortal, that within us there is this component that does not have a time axis. Malanga wonders at this point, but why do we humans die, despite this immortal part? The answer is unique. Because we human beings must experience death to understand through it that death does not exist in this universe. Man must experience duality, that is, the instant in which we must understand who we are. And the only way to understand who we are is to test ourselves, living in a solid reality in which there are experiences, that is, those life experiences such as suffering and joy, good and evil, all dual, double experiences. Malanga argues that man came here on Earth to be able to do so, and therefore it doesn't even make sense to try to become immortal or to extend our life, because only through the experience of death does one understand that death doesn't exist. These theories are undoubtedly very extreme and a source of heated debate in the European UFO community. Who can say if Linda Napolitano underwent all that Malanga theorizes? Probably only time will reveal it to us. One thing, however, is more than certain. Out there, looking up, the universe shows itself to us. Now we have to ask ourselves the question: what is it hiding from us? Without a hint of a doubt, ufology, over time, will help us to broaden our knowledge, as there are many topics that even unwittingly deal with this subject. Evidence of this can be found in the various research teams that, formed over the last 60 years, have collaborated with each other in order to fully understand the phenomenon. These teams are mostly made up of physicists, the military, astronomers, astrophysicists, and many others. There is still a lot for us to discover. The explored universe is only 1% of the known one. The known universe is only a tiny fraction of the entire universe.